What happens when one of Hollywood's biggest legends walks onto a talk show and things spiral completely out of control? What you're about to hear is a conversation that went from charming to controversial in a matter of minutes, ending with security being called and a guest being escorted off set. Before we get into this unbelievable exchange, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think went wrong here. Now, let's dive into what actually happened on Kelly Clarkson's show that had everyone talking. The show began like any other episode. Kelly Clarkson, known for her warmth and easy charm, welcomed Michael Douglas to the stage with enthusiastic applause echoing through the studio. Douglas waved to the crowd, smiling as he took his seat. Kelly greeted him with a hug, clearly excited to have a Hollywood icon sitting across from her. She praised his decades-long career, calling him one of the most influential figures in modern cinema. Douglas thanked her politely, his tone calm, relaxed, even appreciative. At first, everything felt comfortable and familiar. Kelly eased into the interview with a broad question about Hollywood and how much it has changed over the years. Douglas paused before answering, and that brief silence marked the first shift in the room. He spoke thoughtfully at first, questioning whether all the changes were truly improvements. Kelly nodded, encouraging him to expand, expecting a reflective answer about technology, streaming, or evolving audiences. Instead, Douglas leaned into something deeper. He spoke about fear in the industry, about artists being afraid to speak honestly, worried about backlash, cancellation, and public outrage. The audience grew quieter as his tone sharpened. Kelly listened carefully, but her expression changed as she gently pushed back, suggesting that people today were simply more aware of how words and stories affect others. Douglas didn't agree. He argued that awareness had turned into control, that creativity had been replaced by caution. According to him, Hollywood no longer rewarded bold storytelling but punished it. The conversation, once friendly, now carried tension. Kelly tried to redirect, pointing out that many past risks harmed marginalized communities, and that change was necessary. Douglas bristled at that. He dismissed words like problematic and offensive, calling them tools used to silence complexity. Kelly remained composed, but the warmth in her voice faded. She spoke about responsibility, about media's power to shape culture. Douglas fired back, questioning who. By this point, the studio felt heavy. The audience wasn't laughing or applauding. They were watching something raw unfold. What began as a respectful discussion was clearly becoming something else, and neither side seemed willing to step back. This was no longer a standard talk show interview. It was the beginning of a confrontation neither of them appeared ready to abandon. As the conversation continued, the tension thickened with every exchange. Douglas spoke faster now, his frustration increasingly visible. He argued that fear had become the dominant force in Hollywood. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of casting the wrong person. Fear of exploring uncomfortable truths. In his view, that fear led to bland, safe content that avoided risk altogether. Kelly listened, but her posture stiffened. She pushed back firmly, saying that what he described as fear, many others experienced as long overdue accountability. She pointed out that storytelling had expanded, not shrunk. More voices were finally being heard, more perspectives represented. To her, that wasn't mediocrity, it was progress. Douglas challenged that idea, questioning whether diversity had become a checkbox, rather than a meaningful creative choice. The word boxes seemed to land hard in the room. Kelly's tone sharpened as she accused him of oversimplifying an incredibly complex issue. Douglas didn't back down. He suggested that disagreement itself had become unacceptable, that anyone questioning the current direction of the industry was instantly labeled backward or dangerous. Kelly responded that honest disagreement was different from dismissing lived experiences. She said that from her perspective, Douglas wasn't offering nuance. He was minimizing real struggles. That's when the exchange turned personal. Douglas questioned why his opinion was shocking, implying that he was expected to agree simply because it was the dominant narrative. Kelly stood up from her chair, surprising everyone. Her voice was firm as she said this was not the direction she wanted her show to take. Douglas remained seated at first, looking up at her, clearly stunned. He accused her of shutting down conversation because it was uncomfortable. Kelly responded that she wasn't silencing him. She was protecting her platform from being used to dismiss inclusion and representation. Douglas stood as well, now face to face with her. He bristled at the idea that he needed to echo her views to be welcome on the show. The audience sat frozen. No applause, no laughter, just silence. Kelly pointed toward the side of the stage and announced that the interview was over. Douglas challenged her, asking if disagreement was really grounds for being removed. Douglas argued that he was being painted as a villain for raising concerns about creativity. Kelly countered that his complaints came from a place of privilege, one he refused to acknowledge. That word hit hard. Douglas flushed, visibly angry, accusing her of dismissing his entire life and career with a single label. Kelly denied that, saying she was asking him to consider perspectives beyond his own. The back and forth intensified, both of them talking past each other, each convinced the other wasn't listening. What had once been a polite discussion now felt like a standoff, and the atmosphere in the studio was on the verge of breaking completely. The argument escalated rapidly. Douglas questioned whether it was fair that actors and writers now felt constrained by identity politics, consultants, and public backlash. He described a system where one mistake could end a career overnight. Kelly responded sharply, saying he was confusing accountability with oppression. Consequences, she argued, were not persecution but progress. Douglas shot back, asking who decided those consequences. He described social media as a mob, acting without context or due process. Kelly's voice dropped into a calm that felt more dangerous than shouting. She said she saw it as marginalized people finally having power to push back against systems that excluded them for decades. Douglas stepped closer, accusing her of believing she was on the right side of history while enforcing conformity. Kelly stood her ground, saying she was on the side of basic human decency. To her, discomfort was sometimes necessary for growth. Douglas rejected that, calling it intolerance disguised as morality. At that point, murmurs rippled through the audience. Kelly seemed to realize just how far things had gone. She stated clearly that the conversation was no longer productive. Douglas interpreted that as meaning he refused to agree. Kelly turned toward the wings of the stage and called for security. The word security landed like a shockwave. Douglas looked genuinely stunned, asking if she was really calling security over a difference of opinion. Kelly explained that he had refused to respect her decision to end the interview and was continuing to hijack the show. Douglas accused her of hypocrisy, saying she had labeled him privileged, dismissive, and uncaring. Kelly's voice shook as she replied that his complaints sounded hollow compared to people fighting just to exist in the industry. Douglas lashed back, accusing her of living in a bubble, surrounded by people who always agreed with her. Kelly responded coldly that the interview was over. When security appeared, the situation became painfully real. The guards looked uncomfortable, unsure how to handle a Hollywood legend in the middle of a live taping. Douglas asked for a moment and turned back to Kelly, his anger giving way to disappointment. He said the saddest part was that they weren't that far apart and might have found common ground if they weren't performing for an audience. Kelly didn't soften. She said common ground required respect, something he hadn't shown. Douglas argued that he came for a real conversation, not a scripted exchange. Kelly replied that being real didn't mean being cruel or dismissive of others' experiences. Douglas accused her of dismissing him entirely, turning every point he made into a moral failure. Kelly crossed her arms and said he had made himself the villain by complaining about having to be thoughtful about representation. The guards waited silently as the tension hung thick in the air. Douglas looked exhausted now, but he kept pushing. He said his priority had always been meaningful art, stories that challenged people and reflected reality. Kelly replied that his words made it sound like creative freedom mattered more to him than other people's dignity. Douglas stared at her, asking if she truly believed that. Kelly said she didn't see another conclusion based on what he had said. Douglas turned slightly toward the audience, then back to Kelly, suggesting that maybe they wanted the same goals but had different concerns about how to achieve them. He argued that it was possible to support inclusion while still worrying about creative freedom. Kelly rejected that, saying those arguments were often used to undermine progress and preserve the status quo. Douglas insisted he was making honest observations, pointing again to fear as Hollywood's defining emotion. Kelly responded that maybe fear wasn't entirely bad, that it could make people think twice before causing harm. Douglas asked at what cost, arguing that sanitized art failed to reflect real human complexity. Kelly's voice sharpened as she called those arguments excuses, comparing them to past resistance against change. She said every time the industry was pushed to be more inclusive, people claimed art would suffer, and every time it actually improved. Douglas shook his head, saying she refused to acknowledge trade-offs. Kelly countered that discussing trade-offs often became a way to stall progress. Douglas replied that refusing to discuss them created a culture where only one viewpoint was allowed. The standoff felt endless, both sides locked in their convictions. Finally, Kelly gestured again to the security guards. Douglas, defeated but still defiant, allowed them to escort him toward the exit. As he walked away, he turned one last time, warning that shutting down uncomfortable conversations would only deepen divisions. Kelly watched him go, her expression firm but heavy. When the cameras finally cut, the studio remained silent. No applause followed, no music swelled to smooth things over. What viewers witnessed wasn't just a heated interview, but a reflection of a much larger cultural divide. By the next day, clips of the confrontation flooded social media. Some praised Kelly for standing her ground and protecting her platform. Others accused her of silencing dissent and humiliating a guest. Michael Douglas trended for hours, with supporters and critics dissecting every word. What actually went wrong depends on who you ask. Was it a guest refusing to respect boundaries? Or a host unwilling to tolerate uncomfortable perspectives? Was it accountability or censorship? One thing was undeniable. What was supposed to be a routine talk show appearance became one of the most talked about moments in daytime television, leaving audiences arguing long after the studio lights went dark.